Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our program this afternoon on American freedom and independence, the story of Juneteenth. My name is Erica Griffin, and I am the new Public and Community Engagement Manager at Chicago History Museum, and I will be acting as moderator for tonight's session. We are so very grateful for your patience and your continued support of the work that we do as we navigate through these most difficult times. We are excited for the opportunity to have you all within our museum again when all is safe and all is well. But until then, we're excited to host virtual events and continue to provide our daily content through our CHM at Home series. Now, before we get started, I want to go through a few housekeeping rules so that everyone is aware this event is being recorded and the chat box at the bottom, if you all scroll down, is available for any comments, if you have any issues with audio or video, anything like that. However, if you have any questions, please be sure, I see one, to put them within the Q&A. We are also looking forward to sharing this particular event through the recording with those who were unable to join us. I know there was a bit of a waiting list, so we are excited to be able to provide that. Now, you all are able to adjust the way that you view everyone on the top right of your screen. You can select gallery view, which pulls up everyone. You can select speaker view, which highlights the person that is speaking. We ask that you all stay muted during this presentation as a courtesy to others. However, I think that is the case. You will receive an event survey following this program, and we really, really hope that you do share our feedback as we continue with this type of content. So let us dive right in. Again, we are reflecting on, unpacking, and reconciling with the history that surrounds the Juneteenth holiday, America's other Independence Day, as some have quoted. It is a time in American history that was both very fraught and charged, but also jubilant and celebratory. And we are joined here by amazing scholars, colleagues, friends, coworkers that are here to give us their take through their expertise on this story. Let me first introduce Julius Jones. Julius is an assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum. Julius is committed to using technology to tell new and inclusive stories about the past in compelling and innovative ways. Julius develops exhibition content, conducts research, seeks new acquisitions for the museum, and speaks on a variety of Chicago history topics. Julius is also a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Chicago, where his scholarly interests include 20th century US cultural and social history, particularly the meanings of aspiration among racial and ethnic minorities, with a clear focus on Chicago. I would also like to introduce Brittany Hutchinson, another outstanding member of our curatorial team at Chicago History Museum. Brittany specializes in telling Chicago's diverse stories through the interpretation of material culture and cultural history. Brittany also develops exhibition content and conducts research, seeks new acquisitions, and speaks on a variety of Chicago history topics. And her background in bioarchaeology, with a focus on African-American history related to work stress and enslavement, along with historical archaeology related to African-American lived experiences and culture, aids in her ability to do her outstanding work for CHM. And I would also like to introduce to you our final panelist for this evening, Angela Tate. Angela is a doctoral student pursuing her PhD in history at Northwestern University. Her focus is in Black women's art and politics in the 20th and 21st centuries. Angela was born in California and raised in the DC metropolitan area. Prior to moving to Chicago, she has worked in a variety of archives and museums. As a field fellow, Angela will be working on reviewing grants and their grant-making model of justice, art, leadership investment, and media and storytelling. I am so happy to have all of you here with me today to help us have a deeper understanding of how this particular instance, this particular story of American history affects us all, and how and why that impact is not just on African Americans, but on all of us as collective members of the United States, citizens of the United States. And with that, I would like to turn over the virtual microphone to Julius Jones, who will navigate us through a timeline, a brief history of what we're going to dive into. Julius?
Thank you, Erica, and thank you to my panelists. I'm honored to be on a panel with you all. I'm excited to get into this conversation today because it is one of vital importance. And so for my talk, I will be discussing as a topic Juneteenth and the paradox of freedom. And I think that really sort of properly summarizes what it was like in the moments in which formerly enslaved people had to come to terms and grips with their freedom and try to define for themselves what that freedom would look like, and also deal with some limitations about what that freedom would look like. So I want to start my talk today by talking about the 4th of July. I think, the 4th of July is a holiday that all of us are obviously familiar with. It's a holiday that is commemorated nationally. And obviously, I don't have to give you a history of the 4th of July, but even before Juneteenth came to exist, people were positing critiques of the 4th of July. As we know, the 4th of July commemorates when the 13 colonies determined themselves to achieve independence from Great Britain. And we understand the implications of that for our history as Americans. But even as we think about what that holiday symbolizes, we also have to be mindful of what that holiday does not symbolize. And looking here, we see Frederick Douglass. I'm sure you are familiar with Frederick Douglass, but just in case anyone here is not, Frederick Douglass was born into enslavement on the eastern shore of Maryland. He worked as a ship caulker and freed himself by escaping bondage. He would then go on to be a crusader against the institution of slavery and also against the denial of equality for people of African descent and for all people. Frederick Douglass chronicled his life in written word. His narrative of the life is considered one of the canonical texts of American literature. And he was also a very gifted orator. In fact, he was so gifted in the written and spoken word, many people questioned whether or not he had ever in fact been enslaved, believing that someone of this level of intellect, this level of intelligence could not possibly come from the same stock as the people who were enslaved. But in fact, Frederick Douglass was enslaved and he had freed himself and he had risen to prominence as an abolitionist and one of our country's very first civil rights activists. And in 1852, Frederick Douglass was invited to give a 4th of July speech to commemorate the 4th of July. And he took as his title, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And he posited the claim that the 4th of July was something other than what it had come to symbolize for the majority of Americans to enslaved people. And so I wanted to lift up this quote here from Frederick Douglass. "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted imprudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, all with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Frederick Douglass was arguing that there is an inherent contradiction between a nation that posits itself at its very founding and inception, that it holds truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet this same nation does not afford those rights to enslaved people of African descent, and that this sort of injustice that was permeating really denigrates the claims that are made about America during the 4th of July. And so Frederick Douglass's critique offers us a window into the gap between the stated values of the United States and the lived reality of the United States, a gap that we know would have to be reconciled. It was Abraham Lincoln who said, a house divided amongst itself cannot stand. And so divided between slave and free was an untenable situation that we know the United States would ultimately have to come to grips with. And so that coming to grips was what the Civil War was fought about. We have to remember that at the beginning of the war, the cause of reunion for the United States, the idea that the secession of the now Confederate States was illegitimate, and that bringing the Union back together was the chief motivator for the Civil War, and that is what motivated the Union. We understand that the future of the institution of slavery was vital as well. So we see this tension, right? But for many in the Union fighting on behalf of reunion, slavery was not their chief motivating factor. But that would change over the prosecution of the war. The first sort of sign of change is the Emancipation Proclamation, written by President Lincoln, which freed slaves held in states in rebellion, letting them know that they were no longer slaves. While it is suggested that this proclamation did not free a great deal of slaves at the moment it was issued, it did for the first time make clear the connection between the victory and preservation of the Union and the eradication of slavery. So here we have the former Confederacy as it existed. These are the enslaved people who were freed, enslaved people in border states that had not claimed rebellion against the United States were allowed to remain. So we know that all enslaved people were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. However, even that will ultimately come to change with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, passed Congress at the end of January in 1865 and was ratified and became a part of the Constitution in December of 1865. And this is what formally ended the practice and institution of enslavement in the United States. However, how would people find out about this? How would people know about it? What good is a freedom that you are unaware of? And so this brings us to the power and symbolism of Juneteenth. The end of the Civil War, the Confederacy has formally surrendered to the Union. In this case, this is a scene from Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Here you have the general of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, in his gray, surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant as the commander of the Union forces. This sort of begins the process as the end of the war. Yet again, this information has to disseminate, right? And on some accounts, it would be a year before everyone involved in the prosecution of the war would realize that the war was in fact over. So here we have a moment in which this information, the end of the war, the end of enslavement is happening, yet that information has to get out. People have to be made aware that slavery in this bloody war is in fact over. And so Juneteenth symbolizes something very powerful. It symbolizes the moment in which you realize you are told for the first time you are free. Imagine living your whole life on a plantation, being another human being's property, imagining what freedom would be, but never fully experiencing it. And imagine the moment that someone tells you that you are now free. Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army landed in Galveston, Texas, and proclaimed this proclamation here on your screens about the end of enslavement. I want to read his words because I think they have important resonances for today. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." Now here we have a very powerful tension. Imagine that you are told that you are free, and yet at the same time told that you must work for your former slave masters. This is the message that comes with the celebration, commemoration of Juneteenth. And I think an important message as we sort of understand that freedom, the end of bondage, the end of being someone else's chattel property, is only but the end of one type of bondage, but has to also be the beginning of another struggle for freedom. When we think about freedom, we think about the ability to achieve a full measure of freedom, to not merely not be someone else's property, but to be able to fashion your own life, your own desires, your own aspiration based on your own sort of wishes for your own life, to be the captain of your fate and the master of your own destiny. That is what we imagine to be the full measure of freedom. And yet here, even in the moment in which enslaved people are emancipated, they are denied simultaneously the ability to achieve that full measure of freedom. Formerly enslaved people, now emancipated, have to go about the work of defining what it means to be free for themselves. How are they going to earn their living? Where are they going to live and ply crafts? How are they going to educate themselves and their children? How are they going to participate in the civic processes that define citizenship in the United States? How are they going to protect themselves and their progeny? All of these things that constitute a full measure of freedom were left undecided by the emancipation moment. So now we have a paradox of freedom in which, on the one hand, one is no longer a slave, one is no longer someone else's property, yet the full measure of freedom is subsequently denied to them. And the power of Juneteenth is it is a holiday that both celebrates and simultaneously calls to action. Every year since 1865, somewhere in the United States, people have celebrated Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is not a new holiday. Juneteenth is a quite old holiday, and it's been in continual commemoration since then. But whereas other holidays are mere celebration, Juneteenth is also simultaneously a call to action, and it's the same call that was given out in 1865, and that is, even though we are free, we must still simultaneously work and struggle in order to achieve the full measure of that freedom. And what distinguishes Juneteenth from other holidays is any Juneteenth celebration you go to, you will get a history lesson. So yes, there will be commemoration and celebration, but there will also be acknowledgement of how much further is left to go until we achieve that full measure of freedom, justice, and equality for all Americans. So Juneteenth is a celebration of the moment you realize that you are once, henceforth, and forevermore free. That bondage in which you experienced in the past is no more. But Juneteenth was then and remains now a call to action for all people to ensure that every human being achieves the full measure of freedom, justice, and equality that they are entitled to in the United States and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julius, for that amazing overview. And I'm hoping that it gave those of us that are participating with us some food for thought. That, as you mentioned, this sort of quest, struggle for freedom for African-American people was not siloed. It is not new. It is not as if we are now in the middle of a new story of freedom. It is one continuous journey that I would argue began long before Juneteenth was recognized, long before those of us, our ancestors that were in bondage, were free, all the way back to the beginning, and the parameters were set, freedoms metered out to varying degrees over time until we find ourselves where we are now on the next journey, that continuous journey toward freedom. Something else that you said really struck me. Again, this understanding that Juneteenth is somehow something that is new. People are just learning about it for the very first time. And in fact, historical accounts on the ending of American enslavement do generally center Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, which was, of course, a pivotal legislation. But why do you all feel that this particular story of freedom, that the story of Juneteenth has been overshadowed or unrecognized or simply erased from the American historical narrative? Brittany?
I think we have to sort of first begin with the fact that Juneteenth is a celebration rooted in Black Texas history, right? And so we have automatically oppressions against Southern Blacks that sort of feed into why Juneteenth is not widely known. And quite frankly, I think that those of us who celebrate the holiday and have been celebrating owe very much of it to Texans for sharing that part of their culture and their history. So I think that that's a major role in how people are maybe not as aware of it as they could be.
Absolutely. Angela, anything to add? Yes, I see your hand.
I would also add to that that it also tracks on to the uses that African Americans make of commemoration and celebration. And if you can go back to even the early 1900s when there were a lot of, like 1913, the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 1940 Chicago Negro World's Exposition, there's always like, well, we need to remember who we are, where we came from, show our progress. Our progress is tracking onto the progress of the United States and of the world. And I think that Juneteenth has a lot of ebbs and flows in the public memory because of different historical events where, well, maybe Juneteenth isn't something that is important to us right now. Maybe we need to fight for particular legal things to happen or other issues that are happening in the United States and the African American community, because it reemerged in the post-civil rights movement as like, oh, we need to reclaim our heritage. So I think that there is a particular emphasis on, well, when do we actually need to draw on these historical memories and celebrate them in these commemorative processes?
Absolutely. There is so much power in the idea of memory. And again, that same idea that this is a continuation is also very important, because there are instances where you have to reclaim, you have to remember and understand the impact on the present. And you also mentioned, Angela, that Juneteenth began as a celebratory event in Texas. Anyone want to explain or give your expertise on how African Americans sort of spread this celebration and made it their own, developed nuances across the country?
Yeah, one of the ways in which this celebration spread is it spread with African Americans themselves. So as we sort of see that, while Juneteenth has been continuously celebrated, it sort of ebbs and flows and sort of consciousness, and there are certain spikes in the history of it. And one such spike occurred around the Great Migrations, specifically the second wave of the Great Migration, in which you had African American migrants from Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, areas in which Juneteenth has always been popular, sort of moving throughout the United States and bringing those celebrations with them. I know that's how my family, who migrated from Commerce, Texas to Portland, Oregon, and their compatriots from Texas, from Louisiana, from Arkansas, brought Juneteenth with them. So it's always funny when people say, oh, they this might be their first year learning about Juneteenth. And as someone who sort of, that's been part of my family in a lot of the African American community that I grew up in, we sort of understand sort of how this holiday has been transported now across the United States.
Even though I was raised in the DC area, I am technically like a third generation Californian. My family migrated from the Midwest as opposed from Texas and Louisiana. But like Juneteenth has always been in the back of my upbringing because California passed the law to make it a state holiday in 2002. So it's always been something that's been around every June, and I never thought about it being not a part of the national conversation until I actually left the state.
Absolutely. And just so we make sure we're not using any terms or words that people might not be familiar with, could any of you, perhaps Brittany, give us just a brief explanation of what the Second Great Migration was? We want to make sure that everyone has the same context.
So in short, the second wave of the Great Migration marks an event where Black Southerners moved to northern cities en masse, in conjunction with the Second World War around that time period.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I know many of us that are participating this evening, afternoon, are probably Chicagoans or Illinoisans, but this idea, as you said, of spread, I feel ties into the African American oral traditions as well. You know, spread of words, spread of mouth, that also is a way that, you know, this holiday spread and really took firm roots. Can anyone maybe speak a little bit more about African American oral traditions? Speaking specifically of the spread of this particular event.
Well, I think, you know, one of the ways that knowledge of the end of slavery spread was by word of mouth, particularly as emancipated enslaved people sort of went to rebuild connection, particularly with family that may have been sold to different plantations, sort of reconnecting with loved ones, or simply wanting to exercise that freedom of movement that had been denied to them thus far. And so we sort of see as African American become aware of their emancipation, they sort of go out and literally you would sort of have proclamations like the one Major General Granger made, which sort of says, you know, you're free, but stay where you are. And you would, and African Americans would literally just turn out from the plantations and spread news forth that slavery was in fact over. And you sort of see that spread of information lead to the sort of oral tradition you were talking about, in which news of this event spreads all throughout the South and even up north into quote unquote free territories, that slavery, the practice institution of slavery is in fact over. And that becomes one of the ways in which people begin seeking to rebuild those connections. And so the oral tradition has always sort of been a part of the African American community and even a part of Juneteenth celebration. So like I said, if you go to any Juneteenth celebration, there will be a oral history lesson. Someone will stand up and tell you what Juneteenth is, why we're celebrating Juneteenth, how Juneteenth has come to symbolize both that moment of realizing that you are free, but also that call to action that freedom is a constant struggle. It has to be maintained and nurtured and cultivated and struggled for in order to see that you achieve that full measure. And so that is really sort of the role that oral history, word of mouth, sort of the retelling of the emancipation story plays in the role of celebrating the holiday.
Thank you for that, Julius.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
We're sort of discussing on this panel sort of how we came to learn about Juneteenth, and all of us have an experience outside of formal education and through familial ties and kinship networks of learning about the holiday. So that same oral tradition, sort of the griot type of spreading of the information, is very much still alive in the African American community. And it's been sort of more recent that Juneteenth is discussed in more formal spaces of education.
Absolutely. Go right ahead, Angela. I don't want to forget you.
Well, I'm jumping off of both points in that thinking about the role of the Black church and the Black preacher as the person who is the center of the African American community, even during the time of slavery. And when you think about who was the leader, who was most literate at this period after the Emancipation Proclamation after the Civil War ended. Like, they were usually preachers. So I think that that oral tradition coming out of being a preacher, coming out of the church, coming out of speaking truth to power is also a major reason why Juneteenth also spread, because, you know, the Black church is very interconnected with each other.
Absolutely. And I know all of us on this panel have experienced Juneteenth in many different forms, many different times, but could we share a little bit with our participants, how exactly is Juneteenth celebrated? What are some of those, I don't know, standardized ways that people engage, that they reflect on the day and, yes, celebrate?
So I can go ahead and start. I've always known sort of Juneteenth to be a time for festivities and festival, food and drink and whatnot. There's also sort of symbolism woven throughout the sort of features of those festivities, such as beverage being the color red to signify the color of the blood that was lost during enslavement and the period of enslavement. Additionally, I think that sort of looking to Texas as sort of the root of this holiday, a lot of those festivities and similar practices are very much part of Texan culture. So I think many of the things that we experience outside of Texas are similar to what's been passed through that same network of oral tradition.
Absolutely.
I was gonna say Juneteenth is fun, right? Like I think that, one of the things is it truly is a celebration, and I think it is often sort of celebrated extensively and quite well. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of food, say sort of foodways, so barbecue, things like that. Brittany pointed to the red drinks. There's also a lot of games are often played there, so it has a really sort of festive and celebratory attitude. I know back in Portland there was a time where there was a carnival with rides, right? So it's not uncommon in the South to sort of see carnivals put up with rides that you might see at any sort of amusement park in a lot of ways. So a really sort of big commemorative celebration, fireworks in the evening, parades. I know a lot of times we've seen things like pageants, oratory, spoken word competitions, choir performances. So just a really big celebratory festival, parades. You sort of naming all the ways that people of all cultures celebrate, I think are sort of common to the Juneteenth experience.
Thank you all. Now, we said that it's this holiday has spread all across the country. Wherever you're finding African American populations, there is this moment of jubilance and of reflection and of family fun. But if we could speak specifically about Chicago, was there a driving force, or what was that force? We kind of have alluded to it already, but how did that celebration come to be here? Was it the Black church, simply people moving around, the word of mouth, or was it all of those things?
Yeah, so we have in Illinois a very strong tradition of abolitionists, African American abolitionists, and that dates back to the Civil War. And so even before the waves of Great Migration, we sort of see the commemoration of the end of slavery being celebrated here in Illinois, because it was sort of seen as a hard-fought victory for the small but quite prominent community of African American abolitionists here in the state. As the Great Migration, the first wave beginning in the 19 teens occurred, you start again seeing people bringing these folkways with them, and you sort of see community institutions, fraternal organizations and lodges, fraternities and sororities in the African American church in a lot of ways celebrating this rural Southern tradition as a way to cultivate memberships and loyalties amongst these recently arrived migrants. So you start seeing Juneteenth celebrations in the similar vein that you would see down south, occurring in Chicago beginning in the late teens and early 20s, because it's part of a larger process of trying to integrate, on the one hand, the recently arrived migrants while trying to appeal to them and saying that they don't have to sort of lose all of their culture and all of their heritage as part of becoming a member of Chicago's African American community.
Thank you very much for that. And I believe we have time for one more question. I wish we had more time. This has been exciting. And as a lifelong learner, like I'm sure all of you are, I took lots of things away from hearing from you all. And I thank you for that. So what we've said this evening is that Juneteenth is both a celebration and also an act of protest, asserting or questing for freedoms, asserting your humanity, your right to be free, of course. And we find ourselves now, again, on that same pathway, questing for full freedoms, full measures of citizenship, as you all were saying, those measures of citizenship that hegemonic citizens across the country are able to enjoy. So in the wake of this current contemporary social upheaval and sort of on the precipice of change, is there anything that we can take away from this story of Juneteenth, the ending of the Civil War, that galvanizes us today? And we'll start with you, Brittany.
Well, I think that sort of understanding that even in celebration, as what Juneteenth is, it's an act of resistance. And that's been consistent throughout the entire history of African Americans being in this country, even during periods of enslavement, sort of how objects and materials are sort of held in archaeological sites can sort of relate to that act of resistance. And any instance where one is asserting themselves against a larger, more powerful entity or system is resistance and is protest. So what we're seeing now in our current sort of civil unrest and how we're situated in this intersection of history is that Juneteenth is absolutely an appropriate celebration to be shared amongst everyone who's wanting to have and share liberty with Americans in general. So in that understanding, I think that how we articulate what protest is should include acts of celebration like Juneteenth.
I think back on what is the purpose of a celebration? What is the purpose of commemoration? And I feel like at this moment, Juneteenth, the resurgence of Juneteenth speaks to saying, look, we have been denied full citizenship in the United States continuously over the course of the history of this country. But then we are also celebrating our plurality of being African Americans. And it being an African American and celebrating African American culture does not mean that we are saying we are not fully citizens, but they're saying this is the plurality of what it means to be an American or to be a citizen of the United States.
Thank you very much, Angela. And Julius.
Yeah, I think that Juneteenth is really sort of the perfect holiday because it's the perfect combination of celebration and call to action, right? It's how far we've come, and that always needs to be celebrated and acknowledged because certain strides have been made, and we certainly should never forget that. But it is also a call to action because there is much work to do to ensure, liberty and justice for all. And I think Juneteenth is a moment to both celebrate how far we've come and to sort of reaffirm our commitment to seeing that we continue on the journey of achieving sort of equality for everyone.
Thank you all. And I think those are our takeaways. Equality for everyone, freedom for everyone, access to full citizenship for everyone. And until this population, the African American population, also has all of those full measures, then the country has not fulfilled its duty nor its promise to any of its citizens. And we are getting some really great questions in the Q&A, and I want to share them all with you. We have one asking, where did the name Juneteenth come from? Which is a pretty good question.
Yeah, Juneteenth is a ponmu of June and 19th, right? So as it was told, the story was told of Juneteenth, it became shortened colloquially. So people would, instead of saying June 19th, they would say Juneteenth, and it became sort of synonymous with the holiday. So that's where the name came from.
Thank you so much. And we have another very, very good question. What African-American collections are there at CHM? And what are the upcoming exhibitions that celebrate Black life in Chicago, if any? Are you all able to hear me? Are you all able to hear me?
Yeah.
You can? Oh, okay.
Okay. So in terms of collections, our research center is a wonderful resource. We have an extensive variety of collections. One that's on the forefront of my mind is the African American Patrolmen's League. The African American Patrolmen's League was a group of African American cops who, in response to the unrest of the 60s, formed a union within the Chicago Police Department to document police brutality, police misconduct, and to document racial discrimination within the police force as it pertained to discipline, to promotions, and things like that. And so we have, as an institution, been entrusted with their collection of all of the work they did, all of the cases that they brought to try to bring about police accountability to the Chicago Police Department. It is my hope, though not confirmed, that one day we will be able to turn that collection into an exhibition. But that has not been finalized, and a date has not been set for that.
Thank you for that. Oh, go ahead, Brittany.
We also have the papers of Irene McCoy Gaines, Timuel Black, and I believe Thyra Edwards, sort of individuals whose documents and papers we have in our collection. And I do sort of echo the hope that we can use a lot of our resources in upcoming exhibitions and programs in the future.
Fantastic. Are there any exhibitions, another question, any exhibitions on display right now that might feature parts of the African-American holdings of CHM?
Currently there is, which is in the building, the MLK exhibition that is still up, remembering Dr. King. We do have artifacts and other features around the museum that speak to the African-American experience in Chicago. Of course, as an institution that is determined to consistently share Chicago stories, those exhibitions and objects and items are constantly sort of being revised for, rotation. So we have quite a bit that we hope to share with the public and with anyone who wants to learn more.
Fantastic.
I would also call out our permanent exhibit on Chicago, as certain events in Chicago history, African American history are represented, and some information about African American Muslims is included in our American Medina exhibit, which is about the Muslim American community here in Chicago.
Thank you very much. And I will also add this, which I thought was very, very pointed. All of you as professional historians, curators, how are you all able to use your skill set to speak to these histories that may not necessarily get the visibility that they need. How are you all using your roles at CHM, Angela as a doctoral candidate at Northwestern, and also working with Field Foundation to highlight some of these stories?
Well, dissertation, of course, which is going to be about 200 pages looking at Black women here in Chicago, performers here in Chicago, in the Caribbean and in West Africa. But on a day-to-day basis, I have an Instagram account called The Glamorous Academic, where I share a lot of interesting stories about Black women, authors, performers, poets, just a lot of interesting things that I come across on a day-to-day basis. Because I'm very interested in how people learn about history on the internet.
Yeah, I think we all are at this point. That's the best way, I would argue. You know, you can reach so many people and have such a large impact online. Yeah, Brittany, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're totally fine. Through our work at CHM, of course, exhibitions and generating content to sort of be added to either programming exhibitions, whether it's going to a blog or whatever we're hoping to sort of affect change or make any type of additions to. So our job as content creators relies on us to generate as much as we can, as much as, you know, we are able to. So for the most part, it's our duty to work on behalf of the public to share what information that we have.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that my co-panelists said. Also, just things like this, just events where we talk about history, you know, that this is a part of our job, and we are, you know, committed to sharing history, particularly history that's not often shared, you know, whenever we can. A question just reminded me that, you know, we do have a extensive photography collection. We have millions of images, and African Americans are represented in those images. We have the newspaper photo morgue, which was known the Chicago Sun-Times and Daily News newspapers. So that is a resource for photography around a host of subjects, including those pertinent to African American life. And we had an exhibition that has closed since, but on blues and Chicago blues music, and that is that exhibition was largely based on the photography of a man named Rayburn Furlodge. And so we have his photography collection in which he sort of documented the blues scene in Chicago through photography and other sort of daily life and other sort of musical performances as well. So our photo collection is also a resource as well.
Thank you. And actually, Julius, you answered my next question that I had, which was, is there any representation, which of course there would be, within the Chicago Sun-Times collection of lived experiences for African-American Chicagoans, which you've already mentioned, which is fantastic.